Hi students, I wanted to provide this video for you just to provide that brief synopsis of history of the Middle East from the ancient period up until the end of World War I, where we really jump in and start this class, which we'll be doing next week. We went over this a little bit in class today for those of you who were there. If you weren't, or if a review of that would be helpful, I'm going to do a bit of review. So a lot of this should sound familiar to you if you were with us on Friday. But I am emphasizing a couple things at the end that I didn't have time to really highlight enough. So listen up to this presentation and pay attention, particularly at the end, about what's going to kind of lead into this post-World War I Middle East and what some of the issues are that we're already grappling with at that time. So this is super low production quality. If this video is helpful, let me know. And maybe I'll have someone from our media team here at Lindenwood help me make a really nice version of this someday. But for now, I'm gonna flip camera around, if it will let me. No? Okay, I'm just gonna flip my phone around and show my screen. So we talked today about the geography and topography of Mosul in particular. Notice we've got a major river, much like we do here in the St. Louis area. In fact, we have two of them, much like we do in the St. Louis area. If we back up enough, we see we've got the Euphrates over here, the Tigris. But unlike this area, in between these rivers, you get much away from that river basin at all, and it becomes very arid, very dry, quite quickly. Unlike here. So we have a very overall arid landscape with these major rivers running through it. Tigris, Euphrates, and then if you come down here, you can see there's land that gets a little more rainfall, it's a little greener, and then down here we have the Nile River in Egypt, another major river. So this forms what has often been referred to as the Fertile Crescent. I'll trace it with my mouse here. Major rivers going up here this way. Land with like semi-arid land here that can sustain some small populations. And then another huge major river here. What happens in the ancient period when we have these major huge water sources surrounded by arid land is you can sustain very large populations, but it requires a lot of social and political organization in order to harness these rivers for things like irrigation to sustain large-scale agriculture, as opposed to, say, along the Mississippi and Missouri rivers, where you have typically adequate rainfall to sustain agriculture without irrigation. That's why in North America, we tended not to see large empires in the ancient period. We tended to see smaller, usually tribal social organization. So that's kind of our ancient backdrop. When I switch to our map with the empires on it, you're going to notice the empires tend to hug this Fertile Crescent. And you'll see the margins lying kind of outside of the empire usually include the Arabian Desert on the Arabian Peninsula here. And then if we look further to the west, the Sahara Desert in Africa. So I'm going to switch over now to our video that shows map of the world. I'm going to back up a little bit, and you'll see already right here we've got Byzantine and Sassanid empires. I'll go forward a little bit here. You'll notice the Byzantines took over some territory there. There was a lot of back and forth warfare between Byzantine and Sasanian empires, but the empires are again hugging this Fertile Crescent, leaving desert areas like the central Arabian Peninsula and the Sahara over here as marginal lands. Those marginal lands outside the firm control of empires were typically inhabited, kind of like mountains also tended to be, by tribal peoples. And these tribal peoples had a relationship to these empires. they would benefit from them, sometimes by trading with them to gain from the empire's wealth, sometimes raiding their frontiers in order to gain wealth. And every so often, if empires got particularly weak, those often tribal, nomadic frontier societies might muster an army, come in, and take over those empires. When they did, it was pretty typical for them to adopt a lot of that empire's, of the society's practices and even religion. It made it much easier to gain and maintain hold over their rule of that area. So that was not unusual. It happened occasionally. But when we have the Prophet Muhammad and the community that rises up around him with early Islam, we're going to have something a little different. What we have is a large federation of Arabs that rises up around Islam. And if I play this here, you'll see we'll quite quickly start to not only consolidate power over the Arabian Peninsula, but also start to conquer some of this imperial territory from the Byzantine and Sasanian empires, which were weak at the time, raising taxes on the population, making them unpopular. It was ideal conditions for someone new to present themselves. And the Arab Muslim armies did just that. And I'll continue this map forward. So we're looking at the 650s right now, and you can see the Umayyad Caliphate, the first caliphate or successors to Muhammad, established the biggest land empire to date, and then they're overthrown by the Abbasids. I'll pause it here. These are Muslim empires who are going to be ruling over the existing populations, by and large, not forcing or even usually encouraging conversion. The Umayyads actually actively discouraged conversion among non-Arab subjects to Islam. Now, the Abbasids were more open to non-Arab subjects converting to Islam, but they were still very tolerant of non-Muslims under their rule. I'll hit play again. And after the Umayyad and Abbasid caliphates, we're going to watch as other Muslim empires arise. The Abbasid Empire will break up into some smaller empires. It will lose some of its sovereignty. You'll begin to see other Muslim empires show up on the field. And if I flash forward a bit, the Mongol Empire is going to come through and really devastate quite a lot of the known world at that time, but right up into our Middle East. But like many such nomadic conquering warriors, they'll conquer and then they'll quickly adopt the religion, many of the practices of the land that they conquered. So they will turn into Muslim empires, and we're seeing various Muslim empires appear and disappear here that were all all related to or springing from those Mongol conquests toward the later centuries here. Now we're up into the 1500s, and you can see we have three main empires, two in the Middle East. We have the Ottoman Empire arising here, Safavid Empire over here, and Mughal Empire way over here in India. So that's getting a bit out of our scope for this class. But these three empires are all Muslim empires, and by the 1500s, they are all developing gunpowder technology, which makes them incredibly strong militarily, and they're also very successful at administering large empires. They have very centralized power and effective, efficient bureaucracy. And the Ottoman Empire in particular is going to do a very good job of tolerating minorities and also letting local political traditions and things like that continue. So being kind of hands-off when it comes to local governance. And that's going to be a tradition that predominated in this region. Long tradition of empires coming and going, but local politics and society continuing to operate in very similar ways to what they did before. So that is all part of the success of these gunpowder empires, is not only the military technology, but also just their success in administering their territory. The Ottoman and Safavid empires, these three are not friends, they are rivals. And the Ottomans and Safavids in particular are very fierce rivals. They will fight back and forth over the area known today as Iraq. So the city of Mosul, along with the city of Baghdad, will be a few times over change hands between Ottoman and Safavid rule. And whereas these empires, the Ottoman Empire in particular, had this history of tolerance towards different religious groups, in the context of this back and forth with the Safavid Empire, this rivalry, it will lead to religious dimensions of this conflict. I'm going to let it play forward here a little bit, and you can just watch the lines move back and forth some. I think we just caught the tail end of it there. You can see some of that movement. There's the Safavid conquests. You can see that line is going right along the Tigris right now. And each time the Ottomans or Safavids reconquer Iraqi territory from each other, they're going to forcibly convert, because each of these empires is using, in the case of the Ottoman Empire, Sunni Islam, and in the case of the Safavid Empire, Shia Islam, as their sort of legitimating ideology, right? The Ottoman Empire positions itself as the defender of Sunni Islam against the Shia Safavids, and vice versa. So that will bring a religious development to the conflict along the border between these two empires. But all of these will remain very strong empires until something very unexpected happens. And that unexpected thing is going to be the rise of European power. And I'm gonna flip my camera around for now so you can see me again. Again, I know the production quality here is awesome, isn't it? But listen, the rise of Europe, if you will, right? And by that I mean the rise of economic power, military power, and you could add in diplomatic power along with that, right, of Europe, took the Islamic world by surprise. European merchants started making inroads into the Eastern Mediterranean part of the Ottoman Empire throughout the 17th centuries especially. And then by 1799, the Ottoman Empire and the Muslim world really got the shock of its life when Napoleon managed to conquer Egypt. And he didn't hold it for long, but still, the idea that any European military could penetrate the Islamic world in that way, a really prominent part of the Islamic heartland, was a real shock to the system. And the Ottomans in particular decided that the Europeans were suddenly a threat that needed to be taken seriously. And so Ottoman sultans or rulers began seeking to reform first the Ottoman military. They wanted to adapt some of the European weaponry that they developed and also learn European tactics. So along with trying to adapt the technology, they also sent officers to Europe to train in military tactics. what that kicked off was this process where people would go to Europe to train in military tactics, but they also learned about European economic, political, and social systems, and some of them got kind of interested in those too. So while in the beginning the reforms were all purely military, over time, as certain sectors of the Muslim population that interacted more with Europeans got interested in political, economic, and social systems, some of them thought that those reforms should be incorporated as well. Now, they didn't just want to copy Europe, but they wanted to find the things they thought would be useful in strengthening not only the Ottoman military, but Ottoman political rule and strengthening the Ottoman economy. And also, these people were thinking about their own particular interests too, right? So whatever would serve the Ottoman or their political interests, they wanted to come back and implement those as reforms. Put some of those things into place, change some things. This is really important backdrop for our class. I've mentioned before, we want to ask, when change happens, who are the winners and losers in this change? What are the different groups of people, different, religious elites, secular elites, peasantry, farmers, urban workers, right? Who are the different groups at play here? And when change happens, whose interests are enhanced, or who has new opportunities, and whose interests are threatened, right? So let's talk about these reforms just a little bit. We're talking now 1800s, 19th century, right? And we're talking Ottoman Empire. To meet the challenge of Europe, the reformers in the Ottoman Empire, about say second generation into this reforming push, when they start thinking about more than just military reforms, some of the things the Ottoman Empire does are land reforms, where land that might have been held in, let's say, more tribal or communal kind of organizations, is going to move toward a more private land ownership model, where land is bought and sold the way that they're doing it in Europe. So hold on to that thought for a second. Another reform they're going to be doing is the education system. These reformers believe that to strengthen the Ottoman Empire, not just military, but also the bureaucracy, the political power of the empire, that they need secular school systems, right? So instead of drawing all of the bureaucrats and all of the political elites from, many of them came from the religious schools taught by the ulama, or the Islamic scholars. They wanted to not do away with that, but create a system of secular schools where they could train up bureaucrats and stuff in modern methods of administration and political rule, modeled to a certain extent after Europe, right? What that does is then those ulama who teach in the religious schools are teaching graduates who will go on to do what? Well, their graduates used to do all sorts of stuff. They worked in the government. They were bureaucrats. They held positions of power, right? They had control over wealth, all kinds of stuff. Now, all of a sudden, their purview is limited to the religious sphere. So they still have control over civil law, things like marriage and divorce, stuff like that. And religion still plays an important role in society. So there's still a prominent role, but the whole bureaucratic sector, a lot of their influence has been cut out. So their influence has been severely circumscribed, right? So winners, losers, a lot of them are feeling like losers in this case, right? And so you have a situation where in this Muslim empire, the religious scholars start to go on the defensive, and that'll shape the way that the religious elite react to these modernizing reforms that are happening, right? Why do I point all this out? Well, we've talked about Orientalism in this class, right? One of the things that Orientalist scholars used to say was that Islam as a religion and the culture of Islamic societies were just somehow antithetical to the modern world and modern ways of doing things, right? The religion of Islam just wasn't suited in the way that Christianity apparently was for the kind of modern systems that make for a successful modern state. That has been hotly contested, and many of us would say largely proven wrong. But, you could argue that. But what's important that I want to point out here is if we ask a different set of questions, right? And again, going back to my idea I've presented to all of you, that if we sort of shift our starting assumption from people in the Middle East are essentially like people elsewhere, including us here in the US, rather than being essentially different, then we're going to ask, okay, if Islamic scholars were opposed to these modernizing reforms, why? Was it because there was something inherent about Islam that was antithetical to these modernizing reforms? Is Islam anti-modern, in other words? Or did Islamic scholars, some of them, oppose these reforms because those reforms threatened their material interests, right? They would have less influence, less power, probably less wealth in many cases because of these reforms. Then they're going to oppose them. And as Islamic scholars, they might frame their opposition in religious terms, which makes it maybe understandable why from the outside Western scholars might think, oh, Islam is antithetical to modernity or whatever. But if we dig a little deeper, we find out it's not the only explanation, and maybe not the best one. I'm almost done. We talked about the ulama being potential losers with these modernizing reforms. Let's talk about some potential winners. And I'm going to introduce a cast of characters that we'll want to remember because they will come up as we're talking about Israel-Palestine, as we're talking about Syria and Lebanon in the weeks to come. The notables. Urban notables. This was a class of social elite throughout the Eastern Mediterranean, so modern-day Syria, Lebanon, Palestine, including what is the state of Israel today. Throughout that Eastern Mediterranean region, there was this traditional social elite known as the notables, right? And this was one of those local power structures that empires, like the Ottoman Empire, would leave intact. When they came and conquered, they would say, notables, you still get to be in charge on the local level. You get to be in charge of your tribes or your towns or whoever you have influence over. As long as you do a good job of making sure taxes are collected and passed on up to us, then we are all good and you can keep doing your thing, right? With these modernizing reforms, and actually even backing up a little bit, with the rise of Europe, with the rise of European merchant capital and economic power, these notables, first off, established direct contact with European traders and were able to benefit economically from direct contact with trade that kind of bypassed the empire, right? So they liked that. The empire, as it's trying to reform and reassert its control, is going to try to do away with things like that. But it is doing that in all the ways we talked about, right? Training bureaucrats and soldiers in new modern methods, and land reform so that they can tax private landowners, Okay, so what do the notables do? They see opportunities here. They have wealth. They can buy up all the land so that they own it privately. They can send their sons off to military schools and to schools that train for bureaucratic service. So look, they have influence in the military, influence in the bureaucracy, in the government, and they have a solid source of wealth from investment in property, right? So they're benefiting from all of this. It's going to change, of course, the relationship that they have with Arab peasants and villagers who live on that land, and have lived under their purview as social elites. But now they're also landlords, right? Charging rent. And I can probably stop there because that's going to be a lead-in to a lot of things that we're going to talk about coming up. World War I will bring the end of the Ottoman Empire, but a lot of things will remain. You'll still have notables, you'll still have the ulama, or the Islamic scholars. A lot of the sort of politics on the ground are going to be still there, but playing out in a new context in which it's not part of the Ottoman Empire, but part of new states formed by European powers, with borders drawn by European powers, and new governments, usually monarchies, put in place by these European powers. That is the point of this history at which we are going to jump in and dig in. So I'm realizing as I wrap up, that was some review, but also a fair bit of stuff I didn't really cover today. So hopefully that was helpful. Hopefully it made sense. You have a short reading, the intro to part 3 or section 3 of the Cleveland book, which is linked as a PDF in the module if you don't have the book yet. So thanks for watching this video. Hope you took some notes. Do the reading, take some good notes on that as well, and show up on not Monday but Wednesday, ready to discuss the new Middle East, which is the point at which we're jumping in here to this history. All right, thanks guys.